Hello, everyone. Today, we have Dr. Matty Major, an assistant professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation and biomedical engineering and mechanical engineering at Northwestern University. He's also a research health scientist at the Jesse Brown VA Medical Center in Chicago, and he directs the NU Masters in Prosthetics and Orthotics research program. Leads the Portal Lab, advancing user-centered therapeutic and assistive devices to improve independence for people with mobility impairments. Matty's leadership spans global and national organizations, from the International Society for Prosthetics and Orthotics to editorial roles with the ASME Journal of Biomechanical Engineering and the IEEE International Consortium for Rehabilitation Robotics. Matty has the longest email signature of anyone I know. Matty, welcome. So happy to have you here.
Thanks, Josh. I never pass up an opportunity to talk about myself, so I appreciate you having me here.
Fantastic. This is going to be fun. So one of the things I love about doing this podcast is I realize I don't know basic things about people I know really well already. So Matty, I don't really know how you got into prosthetics. What originally inspired this amazing journey that you've been on?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. I mean, the short answer is I'm a product of the 80s, when science fiction was obviously very sort of booming at that point. Not that it ever, it never did die away or, it's obviously still very popular. But during that time, human augmentation and, robotics, all that really made its way into sort of popular media and science fiction. I kind of took onto that pretty quickly. I mean, that's, for sure part of the inspiration. But, what I'll say is that, I study mechanical engineering. So, traditionally studied as an engineer. And, a lot of my peers were graduating and taking on jobs that traditional mechanical engineers would normally do. And I don't think it ever really suited me. I was always looking for something where I felt obviously passionate, but in addition to that, whatever job I took on, whatever role I decided to take on professionally, actually had an impact on humanity, on the well-being of humans generally. And so, moving into, I'd say, biomedical engineering and prosthetics was certainly a way to do that. And it kind of merged two passions, ultimately, the sort of sci-fi addiction that I had, as well as the desire to use my engineering skills for, again, the betterment of mankind. So it kind of just, it was sort of a natural fit for me. And I initially intended on actually practicing clinically. It never materialized.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I became more focused on research, and everything just sort of taken off from there. Essentially, I never looked back.
Hmm. Well, I can definitely relate. It's obvious why you and I are friends. But yeah, you don't just engage in interdisciplinary research. You're really you are fundamentally interdisciplinary. You sit in two departments and you're training both engineers and clinicians. It's really cool, very unique organization you live in. Plus, you have the whole VA angle. So, yeah, could you kind of share a little bit about the ecosystem in which you work?
Yeah, I think I'm very fortunate to be in the place where I am. We're as you described. I span all these different institutions, which also means, just given the sort of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary type of research that both you and I are engaged in. Really it nurtures that and it really facilitates that type of work very well. So it gives me an opportunity to not only work with engineers, work with scientists who are focused on engineering, rehabilitation science, biomechanics, and so on, and all those other different disciplines that are related, but at the same time to see not only how that research impacts, clinical practice and the individuals who will benefit from that research, but also gaining ideas and inspiration from real world, right, implications. So those individuals who, either are delivering that care or receiving that care. And so that ecosystem that you described, it goes both ways, right? I mean, essentially, it's what's happening in clinical practice, right? What's happening day to day on the ground, inspires some of the questions that we focus on in terms of research. But at the same time, then we can see how that research makes its way and migrates back to having an impact on clinical practice, rehabilitation science, or rehabilitation generally, whatever that might be. Um, so really, again, it's a street that passes both ways, and that transfer of knowledge and ideas and the impact and implications and so on. Really, I think it's not only inspirational, but it sort of keeps a very dynamic type environment, and it's really fulfilling, as an individual, as a researcher, as a scientist, to be able to gain that knowledge and understand what are those pressing questions that need to be addressed now, and obviously both in the short term and what their implications are for the long term. But again, being able to see that the work you're completing and conducting actually has an impact, actually is clinically relevant, right? Because that's kind of the idea there, and it goes back to your initial question: why am I doing this in the first place? Is you want to have an impact, right? The best way to know that if your research has a meaningful any sort of meaningful effect is by seeing how it actually impacts or influences either clinical practice or outcomes that are related to that are meaningful for the individual who's again benefiting from that research or that technology, whatever you're developing. So it all plays into it, right? And that's what sort of keeps me going.
So this is all so much easier said than done. Most researchers will focus on a particular piece of the sort of translation journey from bench science to real world impact. But you've had a remarkable ability to kind of look at that whole life cycle and play an important role in lots of different ways in the field. Um, how have you found your focus among the vast range of possibilities that you could explore?
Uh, well, you're too kind, first of all, complimentary. But it's focus. That is a challenge. I'll admit that actually is a challenge because this profession is so dynamic, and the research questions that we address can be have really profound implications. And again, just given the nature of the different forces that are at play on how those research questions develop and how the solutions we derive can be applied. I mean, you think about for prosthetics, rehab engineering, you're talking about tons of different disciplines, right? Robotics, material science, biomechanics. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. And so it's hard to maintain focus, I will say. And it's partly because of the excitement and enthusiasm that one, like myself, I sort of bring with me into addressing those questions. But also there's so many different, again, forces and disciplines that play into addressing these questions and designing these solutions that, you kind of, you do to some extent have to free yourself from being too constrained. Again, and I'll refer back to your description as the sort of nurturing ecosystem that we're in right now. I mean, it's a luxury and a privilege because it allows me to be free in that sense, and I can constantly take on all these different ideas that have been generated, and I can try to, at least the best I can, given my capabilities, create a coherent story out of that, right, and be able to use that, and I think that's part of the trick ultimately, and maybe partially where I excel to some extent, and researchers like me, is seeing the forest for the trees, right? There's a greater aim there, and it's how do we take all these individual pieces that we can utilize, the techniques, the tools, the disciplines. How do we pull all that together to be able to address that question? So maybe that's kind of where the focus is. Now, the focus on particular questions, it's impossible, right? I mean, to some extent, I think I get distracted constantly. The research portfolio for my lab looks manic. I mean, it's hard to create a single thread through any of that, but that's something I try to hide pretty well.
That's fantastic. I mean that is a privilege and an honor to be able to have that freedom, and it's interesting. When you are part of an ecosystem that's thriving in the way you describe, um, you don't have to carry it all on your shoulders. There's a shared effort, a shared resources. I imagine part of it too is that you've been intentional in designing a team that you manage to do all of their research, and that's another part of you I don't know that much about. What's your kind of philosophy and approach to, building a team of postdocs and PhDs and undergrads and whatnot?
Yeah, you have to be very intentional about it, right? Um, I will say that again, going back to this concept that a lot of the research we engage in is very multidisciplinary, right? And so, again, being in the ecosystem where within the VA, for example, given my affiliation there, there's an approach that they have, which is whole health.
Mm,
And that whole health approach is really considering patients holistically. And so, you really need to be considerate of integrated solutions, right?
mm,
So, to give you a few examples, for instance, you might really be focused on prosthetic technology, for example, and how we can optimize that technology. But individuals have to use those devices, right? And so, how do you train them to be able to use those devices? Well, you need physical therapists to be able to do that, right? You need therapeutic interventions. And so, part of that consideration is, well, what are the individuals that I need to be able to take on those roles? And so, when I'm thinking about developing a team or assembling a team, that's part of what goes into it. Ultimately, it's nice to have the engineers, right, who are thinking about the technological solutions, but then you need the application, right, and so the implementation of it rather, and so you need the physical therapist. And so, for example, my team that I have now, there are 4 postdocs, and 2 of them have training in physical therapy, and the other 2 are engineers. And so, actually, one's a neuroscientist. And so again, you need to think about how all these different pieces come together. And so that team needs to gel, but they also need to have, complementary skill sets. And so that's a lot of what I think about when I'm trying to develop these teams that are best suited to address these particular questions.
hmm. You mentioned the phrase whole health. Is that a buzzword in the VA?
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah. I have to throw in these buzzwords for sure. Yeah. There's a whole website about it, but conceptually it's fantastic, right? It
Yeah.
makes you think about again integrated solutions. We have a nice study that I'm collaborating with Noah Rosenblatt at Rosalind Franklin University, and this was utilizing combined physical therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, right? To be thinking about how we can improve balance confidence for individuals with lower limb loss.
Okay.
So, and that's somewhat out of my skill set, right? It's not something that I was trained on, but it's certainly something that we're thinking about in terms of how do we apply novel solutions to, improving functional capabilities, daily activity performance for individuals with those types of impairments, right? You need to be thinking about what are those type of integrative solutions that we can utilize to address that maybe no one has thought about before, right? And that's part of the excitement of being involved in this field of work.
Hmm. I hadn't thought of this as a VA priority before, but it's helping me realize that vision around whole health may actually explain a lot of why the VA is such a powerhouse in terms of PM&R, both research and clinical practice.
Yeah, I mean, it really has a tremendous history for it, right? Because that is one of the priorities ultimately. And, they've been, as an institution, they're very supportive and very nurturing of, PM&R and rehabilitative, care. And so, yeah, no, it's a great place to sort of develop these type of projects and see if some of those solutions that we're creating actually have an impact on care. Right. Again, it's an integrative healthcare network, right, and it has all the capabilities to run those types of trials and the resources to run those trials through different hospital medical centers within the VA. So it's a great place from that perspective, absolutely. And one of the priorities for them has been for amputation care, right, and prosthetic rehabilitation. So, in terms of conducting research, again, it's not a bad place to be for sure.
Have you any translational achievements you're particularly proud of? The VA funded research that's translated into clinical practice.
Yeah. So, we're running a couple. We've run a few in the past. We're running a clinical trial now, right? That is focused on a different prosthetic prescription techniques and then combining that with physical therapy. So, you talk about translation. We're not quite there yet with that one in particular, but, I think again, it has really profound implications. And this is collaboration with you as well, but also folks at the VA Puget Sound, University of Michigan, and the VA in Miami. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, we're focused on how can we improve, performance outcomes for veterans with lower limb loss, right? By integrating these sort of novel solutions, and that's one way. I mean, these clinical trials are important because that is one way that you can have an impact and translate those findings into actual care, which is another topic of itself. I mean, in terms of implementation, I mean, that's a whole other thing that we can talk about as well. But that's one example. Another one is technology, right? And so prosthetics and orthotics as well. It tends to be very device driven, right? Just given by the nature of the types of solutions and care that we provide to individuals with limb loss or neurological or musculoskeletal impairments. And so we've been developing for quite a long time, looking at different suspension techniques, and we use elevated vacuum. And so we developed some technology through initially DoD funding and now VA funding, and we're in the process now of trying to move that out commercially. Right. So, and that's a long process. It takes years, right? If you think about, I mean, you know better than most, obviously. It takes a long time. But it's something we're proud of, right? Because the idea is that you have some concept, some idea, you develop that technology, you push it through, and there's always that potential valley of death. You climb back out of that to some extent, and brush yourself off, and then move it along. And the hope is that that technology eventually makes it out. And so, that I think that's one good example of how the VA has been really supportive of pushing technology through to make sure that it actually has an effect and is used. And there are many other examples of that as well.
Do you see the sort of VA clinical practice as, I don't know, maybe step one and then broader, civilian practice as step two? Or is it more of a blended view that you have?
Yeah, it's probably not as clear cut as that. And I think the one thing that I'll say is, and I'll have to be a bit careful about it, but for many other reasons, but the one thing I'll say is that, the needs of veterans, for instance, can be very different than civilians. And
Right.
I see that in the sense that, the care needs, associated comorbidities, the age, right? There are very specific demographics and characteristics of veterans that don't necessarily apply cleanly to civilians, for instance. And so with technology or therapeutic interventions, the research and the solutions that would be focused on veteran care might be very different than it would be for civilian or even active service members, for example, right? So yeah, I mean, there's an application there for sure. Again, because that ecosystem and the sort of institutional resources are very can certainly facilitate research that we're doing. It's a good place. It's a good place to develop those solutions, see if they work, and then eventually potentially take them out and apply them to civilian institutions as well. I don't think necessarily it's a step one, step two per se, but and again, part of for the reasons that I just described. But starting within the VA system itself can certainly have its benefits, right? And again, it speaks back to sort of the integrative care, the end of your integrative, institutions, the VA medical centers. So it's a nice place to actually try and test interventions, see if they have an effect. Sometimes they apply broadly, sometimes they don't, but there are lessons always to be learned.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of scratching my head lately on the differences between, some of the VA centers we're working with and private, rehab centers. And that level of integration between research and practice is definitely one difference. Um, Not that you don't find it in private academic medical centers, but I don't know. You all at the VA seem to have a extra special level of integration between research and practice.
Very, very special. Yes.
um, so, yeah, I wanted to get to maybe some of the specifics around the collaborations that we've done and the sort of I guess, two thrusts. So, uh, one, very exciting work on mechanical testing, which, yeah, I'm wondering if you could frame a little bit in terms of the context. I guess maybe for you it started with the AOPA foot project, but I don't know the full story of how you got into mechanical testing. And then, where you see this going in the future and the importance of mechanical testing and elevating the field.
Yeah, they're great questions. So let's see. So my interest in mechanical testing of, I say, prosthetic and orthotic devices probably started during my PhD.
Hmm.
I have to give credit to my PhD supervisors at the time that kind of turned me on to this idea. And one of the questions that we were hoping to tackle, that I was hoping to tackle through that work, was really trying to address some fundamental questions that we had. Historically, a lot of comparative effectiveness studies had been focused on comparing essentially devices, different devices, right? Device A, device B, and device C. And so all of which are commercial. And so, we don't really know how they function, but they look and they smell kind of different. And so we can
Sure.
apply them to an individual. We can do some repeated measure studies and we can see how, gait biomechanics, for instance, or some other, relevant outcome may look as a result of using, any of these three flavors. And I think, fundamentally, it was hard to really understand why you might sort of achieve a result or no result, right? As a result, by comparing these different prostheses. Um, and, again, it may very well be because, fundamentally, we don't really understand how those devices function, right?
Hmm.
And so you might be comparing different devices, but, they might have a foot shell on them in terms of a prosthesis, what the underlying mechanics are. Yeah, they're made of similar materials, but this one's shaped differently and it tastes different. So, so maybe there's some subtle differences there, but, the results don't pan out. And so you're not really quite sure why. And I think so fundamentally the question is, well, what the underlying mechanism, what is actually taking place here? Like, what is the reason why either you get that result or you don't, right? Why you see a result in those biomechanical measures.
Hmm.
Um, and so, if you think about in terms of trying to answer that question, we really need to know is how a patient, how an individual interacts with those devices. And so what they're experiencing when walking with a device, and again, this also applies to orthoses, but we were focused on prosthesis at the time, is that it's really the mechanical function, right? It's the mechanics of that device. And, again, sort of referencing back to or harkening back to my traditional training of mechanical engineering, mechanical design, you sort of develop an understanding and appreciation that if devices function in a different way mechanically, they will have a different effect on its environment. And so people are walking with devices that, have a very distinct mechanical function from each other, right? They're quite different. That's what they're experiencing, and that's going to affect the way they walk and the way that they engage with those devices. But that had never really been addressed. And so that was kind of the inspiration for it, really. At the time, we called these apes, which I don't use that expression anymore. It was amputee independent prosthesis properties, but I've kind of moved away from that. Um, it was kind of trying to develop an understanding of like, how do apes affect outcomes, right? And that really was what spurred this interest, and it led to tons of different questions, right? Because ultimately, what you're trying to do if you want to optimize the device for a given person, and this speaks to personalization and customization, the individualization of prosthetic rehabilitation, and rehab generally, it's this idea of personalized or precision rehab, is that you're customizing the device, you're optimizing the device. But the only way to really do that is to develop an understanding of what that relationship is between them. How does this, whether we're talking mechanical properties and to define those, we're talking about like stiffness, damping properties, that lend itself to rollover shape, for example. And so if I change the stiffness, what's the effect, right? And I'm talking about broadly and sort of on your general user, right? And so when you start creating those maps, then you can develop optimization algorithms, right? You can say, well, if I know that relationship and here's that landscape between stiffness, damping, and step length symmetry, whatever it might be. Well, I know I can tweak these. I can take that landscape and I can find that optimization point for that generalized individual. And then I can apply that, right? So there's that optimization there. And it speaks again to the sort of fundamental question. Um, a big piece of what's missing there is the characterization of those devices, right? That you and I know very well. And I think that's led to a lot of what you've been developing, right? Through your company and your technology. Because the platforms you have are superb in being able to actually do more systematic controlled experiments of manipulating those mechanical properties, whatever those properties are of the prosthesis or orthosis, and then, assessing their effects on the user, right? And so being able to then have that generalized relationship, and you can tweak and you can fine tune, right, those properties for that individual to make sure you're getting the best result. Um, but yeah, it's the mechanical properties, and so it's nice to be able to do that on an emulator platform, like, like technology that you have. But with commercial devices, we just don't know. You don't know what the actual underlying properties are. And that led off into another whole trajectory of research as well. Okay, how do we characterize these things? Do we need standardized processes to do that? There are ISO standards, but they're mainly for structural integrity and assessing devices to make sure they're safe. But you really want to actually characterize them, and observe their function. And, so going back to your question, I'm rambling here, by the way. You can stop me at
I
any
love it.
it's it's all just exploding out of my head. I can probably see it visually, right? Um, yeah, so the AOPA test, that was, it was one effort to try and develop some standardized processes around characterization. Not so much for structural integrity, like do they stand up to a certain amount of force, but, well, what is the deformation for a given force? So what is their stiffness? What is their hysteresis property? So they're damping, right? And so that was a way to do that. Now, with the AOPA project that I was involved in years back, and I think that sunset back in 2010. So I think I was still wearing short pants back then. But that was the effort to try and utilize those standards that they were developing for classification, which is a whole other thing. But classification of devices for coding, so you can get reimbursement and so on. And you had that, they needed that, sort of standard disclaimer in there to say, like, well, these aren't tied to clinical outcomes, even though inherently they are. But these aren't tied to outcomes; they're really just used for coding purposes and so on. But that kind of set the framework ultimately to say, like, yeah, you can have these standardized tests, right, to be able to characterize devices, and it can be repeatable and it can be reliable. And that was some of the research that we conducted in, when I took over. Part of that was to assess its inter-rater reliability, to see, like, if different people are using these tests, do you get the same result, right? Is it a reliable result? Um, and it is, within reason. But it kind of set the groundwork, right, for saying, like, you can develop these standardized tests, they are valid, they are reliable, and now you can use them for characterizing devices. That again, that's a whole line of research that what you and I are engaged in is, how you develop those tests. What's relevant now? We're not using it for coding purposes. We're trying to, again, going back to that original question, saying, well, if I can characterize the devices, I can then inform clinicians, for example, on how those devices function, so they know and can have more informed decisions to select devices for a given patient. Because again, if you taste and smell 5 different prosthetic feet, yeah, it gives you some information, but it's not enough to tell you how the actual device functions, how it's going to affect their patient, their user. And so that's kind of the drive for all this, is characterize it, inform decision making, but at the same time for research, now you've got function, and so you can create those maps again for optimization. And maybe you're developing algorithms to optimize it for a given set of patient factors. And there was work being done like that in the VA. So, apart from, there's smarter people than me who are working on those algorithms, to say, like, if I have these different patient level factors that go into outcomes, and then I can sort of predict what the outcome is going to be given certain interventions, for example. And if you can throw in the mechanical properties of a prosthesis, we'll say, like, what if I prescribe that device, what's my predicted outcome going to be? It's optimization, right? Because you're trying to maximize either performance, preference, whatever it might be for that veteran patient. So there are efforts towards that extent.
Yeah, in other areas of medicine, this is standard.
Yeah.
The prescribing physician um, has data on how different interventions are likely to affect the patient. They make a choice based on that clinical trials work that's been done. It's unfortunately just so hard to do that in the field of prosthetics because so many of these studies are inconclusive. There are so many options, and people seem to be very sensitive to small changes. So you're definitely preaching to the choir. Um,
Not
I,
easy. Not easy.
yeah, and I think, as I was listening to you talk, one thing I was reflecting on is how, for me and a lot of my journey up until now in this industry, I've felt a bit of a chicken or the egg between the standardization, the mechanical testing work, and the emulation and device trialing work, where it's like, how can we effectively trial without first defining these standards? But the field's been trying to define these standards for so long, and that seems to be a grand challenge that won't be achieved anytime soon. So lately, I've been thinking more about how, just from a pragmatic sense, we've just got to figure out an approach and run with it. And then over time, that approach can grow and improve and change. There's nothing wrong with that, actually. Um, I've gotten perspective on this from the other half of what I do, which is more on the exoskeleton side. And this is a bit of a recurring theme on our podcast, exoskeleton standardization. There's a new ASTM committee that's been formed to define standards for these sort of nascent technologies. It's a brand new market. Um, and it's interesting to see how that field is organizing itself and trying to standardize and wrestling with many of the very same problems that we wrestle with in P&O, but it's a green field of possibility. There's no entrenchment. There's no status quo. It's it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons to that, right? Because you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have a precedent for it, but at the same time, sky's the limit, right? So, you have the opportunity there to develop something based on historical knowledge, what we already know, kind of adapting and adopting that. But there's no one telling you what you can and cannot do in that sense. So, I mean,
Yeah.
that would help. One thing that strikes me is that you mentioned that we do need these standardizations, and we do have to start somewhere. The biggest challenge, and I think this applies to a lot of even technology or different types of interventions within this profession, but you need a champion at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we experience. And so, if I think back to the AOPA test, for example, there was a lot of time and a lot of resources that were put into developing those. And unfortunately, as I indicated, it sunset, right? It didn't really progress any further. But I will say that you will see this, and I'm sure you do, is that it comes up constantly in research articles. People continue to reference it as a form of standardized tests. Um, some knowing and some not knowing that it had sunset and didn't really gain traction and develop anywhere beyond that. But I think it demonstrates that there's a need for it for sure, right? There absolutely is a need for it. And you and I know this because some of the research that we're engaged in collaboratively, some of which is funded, which is nice. And I think, but in order to the development is great, but then it's constantly trying to push that out. It's the implementation, right? People have to buy into it, and how do you sell that? And that's another separate part of what we do, right? Um, and you're engaged in that, and entirely because you run a company to be able to do that. And I sort of do that from the back end and wave back here and like, hey, don't forget me. Yeah, it's like how do you continue to push that forward? Like implementation, and I keep going back to this phrase, and I'm probably beating it to death, but it's so critical to a lot of what we're doing here. Like one way to do that obviously is through technology and through having a company, because you are in a position to be able to actually push out that tech or those interventions, so they can be implemented. And for me, it's challenging in the sense that you constantly need to have champions in the field, and you need to be in people's faces, right, to be able to advocate for what you're doing and make sure that people understand the value of it, right, as far as what you think is the value, and maybe they tell you it's not valuable and that's something else, um, but yeah, I mean that's part of the challenge ultimately, getting these things across the finish line and making sure there's sort of sustainable routine adoption of what you're doing. So when you're talking about standardization, like, again, it's this happens constantly where there are standards that are developed, for instance, and they maybe don't gain traction and they're not utilized. And they sort of pass off, and they sort of die quiet death. So I think that, yeah, no, that just speaks to sort of the difficulty and the trickiness of what we're doing.
I'm starting to see it as standards as potentially carrot and stick. So the stick perspective is we've got this disorganized situation out in the marketplace, And we want to bring in standards to help create a sense of order and logic and how different things are evaluated and compared. Um, but the carrot, which I think is missing a little bit in our industry and could be very powerful, is that standards can make people's lives easier. So if you're a developer of a novel prosthetic foot and you have a standard for how that foot should be evaluated, that potentially makes your journey as you bring that product to market much easier because you can
Yeah.
say, we test it to this standard and we have independent verification. So I'm going to try to toot that horn in 2026 and see how effective it is.
Yeah, keep tooting, man. That's that's what you got to do for sure. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, it would make it easier for sure. But again, people have to buy into it,
Yeah.
right? And I think that you have to demonstrate that as you're developing these standards, they are meaningful, right? You due diligence, right? That they're valid, they're reliable, they make sense on his face. And so I think that again, that's part of our job, right? Is to be able to advocate for that.
Yeah.
Um, and that might have been a challenge with some of the prosthesis characterization in the past that simply hasn't really taken on. I think it's not that it is an easy job. It is by no means an easy job of developing standards for assessing structural integrity of those devices to make sure they're safe. And the standards exist and they're great. But characterization is a little trickier, right? But it's I think be remiss if we didn't mention that though they are developing those standards, right? There are ISO panels working. There are working groups that are trying to develop those, prosthesis characterization, and that's great, right? And we'll see where it goes. And I think like ISO, ASTM, those types of standard organizations, if anyone's going to be able to push this out and make sure that it is adopted, like that's what needs to be done. It needs to go through those organizations essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And we need more collaboration between that world of predominantly manufacturers and the researchers, the developers of kind of the next generation solutions. So that's another goal of mine, building that bridge. Um, for me, the motivation has always been a pretty simple one. You have a person with limb loss come in, put on the prosthetic foot emulator, and you pick a parameter, let's say stiffness, to optimize. And within a couple of minutes, you can see that the participant will tell you how powerful it is to be able to systematically vary just one parameter. They'll volunteer delightful bits of information like, oh my gosh, I've never walked this fast in 5 years. And I'm sitting there thinking, all I did was alter the
Hmm.
fitness by 10%.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think there's so much power in individualized optimization, done with rigor and structure. We're just beginning to scratch the surface.
It's funny you say that, and I in the sense that you're absolutely right. I think we're sort of at this like inflection point where like the technology and the know-how is there to be able to make that quick turn where now we can really, really do a tremendous job at optimization, personalization of these devices and sort of, custom solutions. What's funny about it is that, again, inherently in rehab, that's the entirety of rehabilitation practice, right? Is personalization. Like we tailor all of these solutions. I don't, but people who are on the ground, the clinicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists, prosthetists, physiatrists, right? They're already there tailoring these solutions for these individuals. It is a natural fit for rehabilitation because it's always been precision. It's always looking at the individual, understanding their needs, their motivations, their desires, their goals, and trying to account for all of that to provide to them an optimized solution. I think what's where we are now, and I think this is what you're describing, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have the instruments to be able to facilitate this even better, right? To
Right.
sort of really drill it down and be much more efficient and much more effective in that process. And so, it's talking about the emulation, it's talking about the mechanical characterization. We're giving, we have the tools now and the techniques to say, like, yeah, we can make this even better and faster, right? Um, and you can still maximize those outcomes. So it's a lot of it's a lot of historically what clinical practice rehabilitation is at its core, what O&P is, and it's just sort of building and adding into it, right, and just making it a much more robust type of a mechanism.
Yeah, I could you maybe tell a little bit about the story of how you're using the emulator to explore the relationship between the socket and the foot as an example of what we're talking about, how that is enabling a greater, like, I don't know, detail or focus than was previously possible?
Yeah, I could try. So let's let's see. The study, yeah, the study you're describing is, it's really, again, it's a mapping exercise. What we were trying to do is map that relationship between a few things actually. So three. There's sort of this, the a triangle really here, and it's socket comfort, right? So it's the comfort of the individual, this perception of the individual who has a limb loss, who's wearing prosthesis, how they feel, what their comfort level is utilizing that device. So that's one of those outcomes. The other one is the residuum socket interface pressure, right? And so the two of those are linked together, just based on sensation and pain thresholds and whatnot. And so if you're applying certain levels of pressure, either that's normal or shear, it could cause discomfort depending on where it is and the level of it and the rate. And then the last part of that, connecting it all together, is we're looking at, again, simple, very simple one prosthesis variable, and that is keel stiffness. So the stiffness of the forefoot ultimately. So and I'm describing that really sort of, it's a rotational stiffness that we're manipulating. And we want to assess that relationship between those three variables, because of that, providing that map and understanding, well, what is that relationship between the interface pressure and the comfort, and then how does that relate back to the rotational stiffness of the prosthesis. The idea, the concept really was, well, okay, if I manipulate that stiffness parameter, right, it's going to affect both of those other parameters, and perhaps I can then change and optimize the stiffness. I can tune that to then affect the interface pressure, which is going to change and then maximize comfort, right? And so that's the idea there. And so we've been running trials to be able to do that, and it's been highly successful. So this is a collaboration also with Myung-Hee Kim at the University of Illinois Chicago, and we just wrapped that up maybe a few months ago, and the results are very promising. So what we've been able to do, and I sort of bring this the entire way through and thread it out, is that, yeah, we've established those relationships, which have been great, and now we sort of have some foundation as to what that might look like. Again, it's only one study, and we don't know how this holds to sort of generalized population, but we have those relationships, and so how do we exploit that? How do we leverage those relationships? One of the ways, obviously, is that, as I described before, you can kind of optimize it and say, like, you could change the rotational stiffness of a prosthesis, or if you knew the mechanical characteristics of commercial devices, you might select the right one to be able to, optimize the residuum socket interface pressure to maximize comfort. So that's one way to do that. So it's like prescription guidelines, ultimately. I'm speaking in very vague terms here, but
Hmm.
hopefully it's coming through. But the other way, the other more direct way is, using human in the loop approaches, right? That I'm sure some listeners might be familiar with. And so, what we're doing there is, now we're able to do these systematic sweeps to develop that landscape of what those relationships look like, but we can do it in real time. And so, we can create those loop solutions where you have someone walking with the prosthesis, and you're running through and you're changing that rotational stiffness, and you have computers that are monitoring that interface pressure. And we know that interface pressure relates to the person's perception of comfort. And so the algorithm ultimately is trying to optimize the keel stiffness to get a certain, to achieve a certain cost function result based on interface pressure, which is then meant to maximize comfort. And we've done this, and it's been very successful. And so we can improve comfort by optimizing the device anywhere between 10 and 20%, right? And so,
Hmm.
and that's compared to just like a standard dynamic response type prosthesis. And then optimization, because we're using something that it happens, the result happens very quickly. So if you change the stiffness, you very quickly can change the interface pressure because of the way the forces from the ground are transmitted up the prosthesis into the socket. And so you can optimize that device within like 7 minutes.
Hmm.
And so, it's very rapid, which means it can be very, it can sort of adapt very quickly. And that's kind of the idea there, if you wanted to then deploy that into a standalone device that someone could use in the field. But that kind of gives you an idea of like taking those relationships, establishing them, knowing they exist, and then trying to thread that through and apply them, like essentially port them into a solution that you can see the actual impact of. It's optimization. You can optimize the device in real time to maximize comfort. The other thing I'll say about it real quick is, you know, one of the important outcomes for prosthesis users, and you spoke to this a little bit when you're saying that you can change a device, and someone says, "Wow, I've never walked this fast before," but it's perception, right?
Yeah.
That can be what is meaningful for the individual, right? And
Yes.
so those outcomes tend to be the most important. It is fine to look at, all different types of performance metrics, gait biomechanics. And so you can, develop these really nice sort of interventions that maximize those outcomes. But at the end of the day, what may be most meaningful for the individual is their perspective, right? Their perception on it, and how it changes either their activities of daily living, their quality of life is based on, do they feel more comfortable, right? As an example, right? So those outcomes tend to be critical when we're trying to develop these solutions and really assess if they're meaningful. And it speaks to this clinically important difference, right? And so those are the meaningful outcomes. What essentially are meaningful based on that individual or that group of people. And so perspective, preference, comfort, things like that are absolutely like paramount.
It's it's just such a great example of how everything we're talking about is playing out in a way that I mean, I'm biased, but I think is immediately translatable. Every prosthetist I've spoken to, understands the importance of getting that the foot dynamics and the socket pressure right. Um, and every so often I'll hear someone say something like, "Oh, well, I can achieve that just by adjusting the alignment." Now, clearly, we're entering into a world where there are many more tools, hopefully at the prosthetist's disposal than just changing the alignment. But what would you say to that? Why is this so significant?
Why is the alignment significant?
Uh,
Or
d
process
why is this sort of next layer of capability and in optimizing many more variables so significant?
Yeah, I think hopefully I'm answering this the way you like, but what goes into this is the fact that it is very multifactorial, right? And so from a prosthetist perspective, and I'm speaking for prosthetists here, which is probably very dangerous, but given my understanding, right, if you, for instance, if someone is walking with a prosthesis and maybe the keel, for instance, is overly stiff, right, and so they're having difficulty progressing over that sort of keel portion in terminal or late stance, right? Um, One thing is that a prosthetist might do is change the alignment, right? So you might dorsiflex the prosthesis a little bit more to make that rollover at the end of stance a little easier so someone doesn't feel like they're walking uphill when they're using that device. So the prosthesis really, it's going to have the alignment's going to have a profound effect on it. Um, the other, again, the other factor, and this kind of speaks back to the study that we were conducting about changing the rotational stiffness or the keel stiffness in this sense, and how it affects the interface pressure, is we're doing this independent of anything else, right? And so we weren't concerned about the design of the suspension system or the design of the socket, right? And we're still able to achieve good results. We're still able to improve comfort by doing subtle modifications, and that's important. It's subtle modifications to the prosthesis stiffness, such that if it is aligned in a certain way, we're not completely throwing the alignment out, right, entirely. We're kind of working in tandem with that. And I think that's one of the important things. And that is very tricky, right? Because again, there are so many different ways that you can optimize a prosthetic solution, at least clinically, changing the components, the mechanical design, mechanical function, the alignment, changing the socket design and the suspension system and so on. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. And I think the important thing here is, how do you come up with a solution that still values those contributions and works with them? And so, for instance, if we can create that optimization to improve comfort, but we can do it irrespective of what socket and suspension system you're using, and we're making subtle modifications to the prosthesis stiffness that doesn't completely negate the alignment properties, that's great, right? I think that's a valuable solution there because it still accounts for some of the clinical optimization, that happens clinically and is obviously very important, but it takes advantage of the more sophisticated techniques. I shouldn't say more sophisticated, different techniques that, that utilize mechatronic solutions, robotics, and so on. And so I think, again, it's the challenge of trying to have that, for everything to sort of play nicely together. And for what we're doing as researchers, as developers, as scientists, um, to be able to add value to clinical practice, not in any way sort of negate it, remove it, sort of diminish or trivialize the contributions and the importance of processes when they're designing these solutions, as well as the users, right? I mean, and how they're engaging with the device. Obviously you don't, and this may be controversial as well. And it depends on your sort of your outlook on this, but do you want the device driving the person? Or do you want the person to interact with the device and be able to still be that person, but now working with this new prosthetic technology? And I think there's been some exoskeletons is an interesting place for that as well, right? Is it's a matter of how much do you want the person driving the device or the device driving the person? And maybe that's sort of a longer story there, but yeah, it's at least clinically where we are now. It's making sure that everything that there is a synergy, it all works together, and that's not a trivial pursuit.
As we get towards the end of the hour, you're reminding me of your MSPO dash R program. I was wondering if you could give a bit of a plug for that new program and how maybe it's equipping next generation clinicians to wrestle with some of these questions and incorporate some of these new high tech solutions.
Yeah, I love plugging this. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, this was kind of a labor of love we've been developing over the past, it's like 2 or 3 years now, I guess. So it's a master's in prosthetics and orthotics research. And the idea is that we would have, not have, we will, but we are training graduates to essentially be clinician scientists, right? So they will have dual training both in clinical practice and O&P as well as advanced research training. And so those students essentially go through the entire traditional master's in prosthetics and orthotics curriculum to become clinicians, but then also they're taking some additional coursework in statistics and grant writing and advanced research methods to make sure that they're gaining the training to conduct research. In addition to that, they have to complete an independent research study that is thesis based. They have to submit a dissertation and defend that. So kind of like essentially would be like a traditional master's, and maybe like rehabilitation or engineering. So that, yeah, I mean, the idea there is that we are preparing graduates to take on some of these different roles within the profession. You can sort of see the writing on the wall. At least, I could initially when we were developing this, is that the graduates would be there to not only be clinicians and be well trained and care for patients who make use of O&P technology, but at the same time being able to utilize that information and direct research projects that are meaningful and impactful, and then of course go the other direction with it as well, as whatever research they may be conducting have that actually impact their clinical practice. And so the clinical scientists or clinician scientists, you see MD PhDs all over the place. There's no reason why we couldn't have MPO or MPO MS or a PhD, essential clinician scientists who are trained in prosthetics and orthotics. And I think it could have a really profound impact on the profession. And it's moving in that direction anyways. And so we are unique. We're the only school in the country that has this. So if you're interested, let me know. But yeah, we're really excited. Our first cohort of 5 will be graduating in June. Um, August, excuse me, and we already have our next cohort enrolled, and they're just starting actually. So yeah, I'm quite excited.
That's great. I think there's a big need for this, and I, I'm biased, but I hear from young people all the time that are interested in the crossroads of engineering and clinical practice, and they often don't know where to go next. Um, I think a program like this may help fill that gap for people who they're research curious, they want to explore new technologies, but maybe they don't want to dive into a PhD, which is quite a commitment.
It
um,
can be, yeah.
so okay, super. Well, Maddie, I've really enjoyed this conversation and looking forward to collaborating with you more and more in 2026. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it. Glad I wore my comfy slippers for this once.